When the Harper family brought their newborn daughter Olivia home, they thought their lives were finally complete. But as they settled into their new routine, their 8-year-old son Caleb began acting strangely. Instead of sleeping in his own bed, he insisted on staying in the nursery, guarding his baby sister's crib every night. At first, his parents, Ethan and Grace, dismissed it as an innocent, protective phase, but Caleb's whispered warnings soon grew impossible to ignore. Someone is watching. What began as a simple fear of the dark quickly spiraled into something far more unsettling. Ethan and Grace soon discovered that their home held a terrifying secret, one that had been hiding in the walls all along. As they uncovered the truth, they were forced to confront not only the danger surrounding their family, but also the importance of trust, resilience, and compassion. Who was the stranger lurking in the shadows? And what did he want? Join us for this gripping story of fear, family, and unexpected kindness as the Harpers navigate a nightmare that will change their lives forever. The first night Olivia came home from the hospital, the house felt quieter than ever. The soft hum of the heater filled the air, and the dim glow of the nursery's nightlight cast long shadows across the room. 8-year-old Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor beside Olivia's crib, his small hands clutching a worn blanket. His brown curls fell over his forehead as he peered at his baby sister, who slept soundly in her crib. Grace stood in the doorway, arms crossed as she watched her son. She felt a wave of tenderness at the sight of him, but it was tinged with concern. It had been a long day for everyone, and Caleb had barely spoken since they brought Olivia home. Now, instead of getting into his own bed, he had made himself comfortable beside the crib. "You do not have to sleep here, sweetheart," Grace said softly as she stepped into the room. She knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She is safe." Caleb shook his head. His voice was barely a whisper. "She's so small. I just want to make sure she is okay." Grace's heart melted. She kissed his forehead. "You are such a good brother, but you need your rest too." Just then, Ethan appeared in the doorway. Tall and steady, he was the calm to Grace's worry. He took in the scene with a soft smile. "What is going on in here?" "Caleb says he needs to stay with Olivia tonight," Grace explained. Ethan chuckled and crouched down beside them. "She is fine, buddy. You do not need to keep watch like a guard dog." He ruffled Caleb's hair, but the boy did not smile. Instead, he hugged his blanket tighter. "Please, Dad," Caleb whispered. "I have to." Ethan and Grace exchanged a glance. Grace's eyes held a flicker of unease, but Ethan shrugged. "It is just a phase," he whispered. "He will be back in his own bed in no time." Grace nodded reluctantly. "Okay," she murmured. "Just for tonight." Caleb relaxed slightly and lay down on the floor, eyes still locked on Olivia's crib. Grace turned off the lamp and followed Ethan back to their room. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she could not shake the look in Caleb's eyes, so serious, so protective, as if he knew something they did not. The next morning, Caleb was quiet at breakfast, stirring his cereal without eating much. The usual sparkle in his eyes was dim, his usual chatter gone. Grace kept an eye on him as she fed Olivia, who cooed happily in her high chair. "Are you feeling okay, Caleb?" she asked gently. Caleb nodded, but did not look up. After breakfast, Caleb spent most of the day sitting by the crib. When Olivia cried, he was the first to soothe her, even before Grace could reach her. "He is adjusting," Ethan said that evening as they washed the dishes together. "He was an only child for so long. Now he has a baby sister, and things are different." Grace wiped her hands on a dish towel. "But what if it is something more? He seems scared." Ethan sighed. "Kids have wild imaginations. Remember when he thought there was a monster in the closet?" Grace nodded but felt a hollow ache in her chest. This felt different. That night, Ethan decided it was time to enforce some normalcy. After Caleb brushed his teeth and changed into pajamas, Ethan led him toward his bedroom. No more sleeping in the nursery, okay? You are a big brother, not a babysitter. Tears welled in Caleb's eyes as he clutched Ethan's arm. You do not understand, Dad. I have to be near her. Someone is watching. The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine, but he quickly brushed it off. Caleb, no one is watching. It is just us here. Caleb shook his head, his small frame trembling. Please, Dad, please. Ethan's resolve softened, but he forced a smile. I know you love Olivia, but she is safe. You are safe. He tucked Caleb into bed, kissed his forehead, and left the room. Later that night, Grace lay awake, replaying Caleb's words in her mind. Someone is watching. The phrase burrowed into her thoughts like a splinter. She turned toward Ethan, who was already drifting off to sleep. Do you think we should stay up and check on him tonight? She whispered. Ethan opened one eye. I will stay up, he mumbled. We will see it is all in his head. Grace nodded, but stayed awake long after Ethan drifted off. Just before midnight, Ethan quietly slipped out of bed and padded toward the nursery. He sat down in the hallway outside the door, leaning against the wall. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the baby monitor and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Minutes passed, and just when he began to feel foolish, he heard the soft creak of Caleb's door. The boy emerged, dragging his blanket behind him like a soldier heading to his post. He shuffled into the nursery and lay down beside Olivia's crib, his small body tense. Ethan watched silently, expecting Caleb to fall asleep. But Caleb did not lie down. Instead, he sat upright, staring at the far wall with an unblinking gaze. Time passed slowly. Just as Ethan began to stand, he heard a faint, rhythmic scratching. Scrape, pause, scrape. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his ears. Scrape, shuffle, pause. He glanced at Caleb, who whispered, It is back. A wave of cold fear washed over Ethan as he realized Caleb was not imagining things. Ethan tiptoed back to his room, his mind racing. Grace sat up as soon as he entered. What is it? She asked, her voice tense. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his face pale. I heard it, he whispered. There is something in the wall. Grace's breath caught. Ethan took her hand. Tomorrow, I am going to find out what it is. Grace held his gaze, fear and trust mingling in her eyes. In the nursery, Caleb sat as still as a statue, his eyes never leaving the wall. I will protect you, Olivia, he whispered, no matter what. The next morning, the sun streamed through the kitchen windows, but its warmth did not reach Grace. She sat at the table, bouncing Olivia gently on her lap, while Caleb stared at his untouched toast. Ethan sipped his coffee in silence, his mind elsewhere. I am taking the kids to the park later, Grace said, hoping to sound cheerful. She glanced at Ethan. You need to check the nursery, right? Ethan gave a small nod. Yeah. He set his mug down and reached over to ruffle Caleb's hair. Everything is fine, buddy. You will see. Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the hallway leading to the nursery. Do not put her in the crib, he said softly. Grace froze. She turned to him, trying to keep her voice steady. Why, sweetheart? Caleb swallowed hard and whispered, There is something in the wall. Grace's heart skipped. What do you mean? Caleb's small shoulders trembled. It breathes sometimes. He looked at her with wide, scared eyes. I heard it last night. Ethan's expression hardened, though not out of anger. He wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, old wood, shifting pipes, but Caleb's fear was so real, so raw, it unsettled him. Grace knelt down and gently cupped Caleb's face. Sweetheart, I promise nothing will happen to Olivia. Caleb shook his head, whispering, It watches her. Grace tried to smile, but chills ran down her spine. Go get your shoes, she said softly. We are going to the park. Once Grace and the kids left, Ethan walked down the hall, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The nursery door creaked as he pushed it open. Everything looked normal, the crib, the dresser, the rocking chair. But as Ethan crossed the room, the air felt heavier. The corner near the crib drew his attention like a magnet. He knelt by the wall, running his hand along the smooth plaster. It felt solid, ordinary. "Come on," he muttered. "It is just a wall." But as he shifted, his fingers caught on something, a seam, almost invisible, running vertically along the wall. His breath quickened. He pressed against it, and the panel gave a faint click. Slowly it swung open, revealing a narrow, dark passage. Ethan's stomach tightened. He grabbed a flashlight from the closet and shone the beam into the opening. The smell of dampness and stale air seeped out. He hesitated, then ducked inside. The space was barely wide enough for him to crouch. The beam of light swept across crumpled wrappers, old water bottles, and a thin, tattered blanket. In the corner lay a small, dirty, stuffed bear with one button eye missing. It was a makeshift bed. Someone had been living there. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He backed out of the tunnel, his breathing shallow. He pushed the panel shut and leaned against the wall, struggling to process what he had just seen. Someone was here. When Grace returned with the kids an hour later, she found Ethan pacing the living room. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Grace," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Grace's heart sank. "What is it?" Ethan gestured for her to follow him. He led her to the nursery, careful to keep his voice low so Caleb would not overhear. "There is a hidden passage behind the crib." Grace's eyes widened. "What?" Ethan nodded grimly. "I found things, wrappers, a blanket. Someone has been living there." Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. She instinctively clutched Olivia to her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered. "We have to call the police." Ethan hesitated. "I know, but we need to stay calm for Caleb. He is already so scared." Grace's fear twisted into anger. "Ethan, there is someone in our house. Our children are not safe." Ethan reached for her hand. "I know, but I need you to trust me. We will get through this." Grace stared at him, the weight of their situation sinking in. Slowly, she nodded. That night, after putting the kids to bed, they called the police. Officers arrived within minutes and began searching the house. Caleb stayed in the living room with Grace, his small hands clutching her sleeve as she rocked Olivia. Ethan spoke quietly with the officers, explaining what he had found. A tall, serious-looking officer named Detective Harris returned from the nursery. "We found the passage. No one is there now, but someone was definitely using it. We will run forensics to see if we can figure out who." Grace's grip on Olivia tightened. "What if they come back?" Detective Harris's gaze softened. "We will do everything we can to make sure that does not happen. In the meantime, stay together. Lock your doors and windows, and if you hear or see anything, call us right away." Ethan nodded, though his jaw was clenched. "Thank you." The officers left, but their presence lingered in the air. Grace watched Caleb as he lay on the couch, his eyes half closed. She brushed a hand over his hair. "You were so brave today," she whispered. Caleb stirred and looked up at her. "They believe me now?" Grace's throat tightened. She smiled through the tears threatening to fall. "Yes, sweetheart. They believe you." A flicker of relief crossed Caleb's face, though the fear did not completely fade. Grace kissed his forehead and held him close. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, Ethan sat by the nursery door, flashlight in hand. The room was still, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. Olivia's soft breathing filled the air. Minutes passed. Then hours. And just as Ethan began to believe the worst was behind them, he heard it again, a faint scrape. Then silence. Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened. The whispers in the walls were not gone. The house was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the soft, golden glow of the nursery's nightlight. Olivia stirred in her crib, but did not wake. Ethan sat on the floor just outside the door, his back pressed against the wall, his flashlight resting in his lap. The rhythmic hum of the heater filled the silence, but it did little to calm his nerves. He stared into the shadows, waiting, his muscles tense. His mind kept circling back to the things he had found behind the wall. The blanket, the wrappers, the worn, stuffed bear. Someone had lived there. Someone had watched his family. The thought gnawed at him. Just as the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, the nursery door creaked open. Ethan turned to see Caleb standing there, clutching his blanket. His face was pale but determined. "Dad?" Caleb whispered. "Why are you sitting here?" Ethan gave a soft smile and patted the spot beside him. "Could not sleep. Thought I would keep watch for a bit." Caleb hesitated, then sat down beside him, his small frame pressed against Ethan's side. He pulled the blanket over his lap and whispered, "It is here. I can feel it." Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to tell his son that he was wrong, that there was nothing in the house except for creaking floorboards and old walls. But after what he had heard last night, the soft scratching and shuffling, he could not. Instead, he wrapped an arm around Caleb's shoulders. "If it shows up, we are ready," he said softly. The room was still for a long time. Caleb's breathing slowed as he leaned into his father's side. Ethan began to hope that maybe, just maybe, this was over. Then he heard it. Scrape, shuffle, pause. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like something brushing the inside of the wall near the crib. Ethan's heart began to pound. He held Caleb a little tighter. Caleb whispered, "It is back." Ethan turned his head slowly toward the crib. The noise came again, closer this time, as if whatever was behind the wall was pressing its way toward them. Ethan's stomach twisted. He reached for the flashlight and aimed the beam at the wall, but there was nothing there. The wall stood smooth and still, hiding its secrets. Caleb's fingers gripped Ethan's sleeve. "We cannot let it get near Olivia," he whispered. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "We won't." The noise stopped. The room fell silent again, except for the steady hum of the heater. After a few minutes, Caleb shifted nervously. "Why does it watch her, Dad?" Ethan did not have an answer. "I do not know, buddy, but we will figure this out." The next morning, Ethan could barely hide his exhaustion. He rubbed his eyes as he poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Grace, who had been up early feeding Olivia, noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "You stayed up all night, didn't you?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. Ethan nodded and took a long sip of coffee. "I heard it again," he said quietly. Grace's hand froze over the cereal box. "The scratching?" Ethan nodded. "Caleb heard it too. He was right there with me." He set down his mug and met her eyes. "There is someone in the walls." Grace's face paled. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her hand trembling. "We cannot live like this, Ethan. We have to figure out what is going on." Ethan nodded. "I know. I am going to check behind the wall again. There has to be more to this." Later that afternoon, Grace took Caleb and Olivia outside to play in the backyard. The air was cool and crisp, the perfect distraction for the children. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the nursery, determined to get answers. He knelt by the crib again and pressed his hand against the hidden seam. The panel shifted with a soft click. Ethan exhaled and pulled it open, revealing the narrow tunnel behind the wall. The stale air greeted him again, carrying the scent of dust and decay. Ethan aimed his flashlight down the passage and braced himself. Then, with a deep breath, he crawled inside. The tunnel walls were rough, made of old wood and plaster. The farther he moved, the darker it became. The tunnel opened into a small, hidden chamber. Ethan's flashlight illuminated every corner. The makeshift bed was still there, a worn blanket folded neatly on top. There was a small pile of trinkets, a rusted spoon, an old book with frayed pages, and a cracked porcelain doll missing one arm. Ethan's throat tightened. It was like stepping into someone's forgotten life. He leaned in to inspect the wall on the far side of the chamber, running his fingers along the wooden planks. His hand brushed against a loose board, and he pried it open carefully. Behind it was a hollow space, large enough for someone to crawl through. It led deeper into the house, maybe even to another room. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whoever had been here had built an entire network of hiding spots. That evening, after dinner, Ethan called Caleb into the living room. Grace sat beside Ethan on the couch, holding Olivia close. Caleb stood in front of them, shifting nervously. Ethan patted the cushion beside him. "Come here, buddy." Caleb climbed onto the couch, his small legs swinging over the edge. "Caleb," Ethan began gently, "I need you to tell me everything you remember, about the noises, about what you saw." Caleb hesitated, biting his lip. Then he whispered, "The first night Olivia came home, I heard footsteps in the wall." He glanced at Grace, then back at Ethan. "Sometimes I saw him." Grace's breath caught. "You saw someone?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Only for a second." He would stand near Olivia's crib, but he never touched her. He just looked at her, like he was sad. Ethan and Grace exchanged a horrified glance. Grace's hands tightened around Olivia, and Ethan's heart sank. "You should have told us sooner," Ethan said gently. "I was scared you would not believe me," Caleb murmured. Ethan pulled him into a hug. "We believe you now, buddy, and we are going to make sure you are all safe." Caleb clung to his father's arm. "What if he comes back?" Ethan kissed the top of Caleb's head. "He won't," he promised, though fear still gnawed at him. "We will figure this out, together." In the quiet nursery, the nightlight glowed softly. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, as though they still held secrets. But now, Caleb was not the only one keeping watch. The house was quiet when Ethan woke up early the next morning. Grace was still asleep, her arm draped protectively over Olivia, who lay nestled between them after a restless night. Ethan's eyes flicked to the nursery door, slightly ajar. Caleb's room was across the hall, but Ethan already knew his son was not there. He pushed himself out of bed and walked to the nursery. Just as he expected, Caleb was curled up on the floor beside the crib, his blanket pulled up to his chin. Ethan's heart tightened at the sight of him. His son, barely 8 years old, carrying a burden too heavy for his small shoulders. Ethan crouched beside Caleb and placed a hand on his back. "Hey, buddy." Caleb stirred and blinked up at him sleepily. "Did it come back?" Ethan's chest ached at the question. "Not last night, but we are going to make sure it never comes back." Caleb nodded, his eyes still clouded with worry. Ethan gave him a reassuring squeeze before standing. He needed answers, and he was done waiting. Later that morning, Grace took Caleb and Olivia out for a walk around the neighborhood. The crisp autumn air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves, but Grace's mind was miles away. She had tried to be calm for the children's sake, but fear tugged at her thoughts like a relentless tide. Caleb held her hand as they walked, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. "Are you okay, Mom?" Caleb asked softly. Grace forced a smile. "I am okay because I have you with me." Caleb nodded, but said nothing more. Back at the house, Ethan moved through the nursery with quiet determination. He locked the door behind him and pulled out the flashlight from the closet. His pulse quickened as he knelt by the crib and pressed his hand against the seam in the wall. The panel gave way with a faint click. The passage yawned open, dark and narrow. Ethan crouched low and crawled inside. The air felt colder in the tunnel, thick with dust and the weight of things long forgotten. The flashlight's beam illuminated every crack and splinter in the wooden walls. He reached the small hidden chamber again. The makeshift bed was still there, an old blanket folded neatly on the floor, surrounded by the odd collection of trinkets. Ethan's gaze drifted over the rusted spoon, the frayed book, and the broken doll with its cracked face. Each item told a story of someone clinging to pieces of a life that no longer existed. Ethan swallowed hard and turned his attention to the loose wooden board at the back of the chamber. He pried it open carefully, revealing a second narrow tunnel. His breath caught in his throat. The space behind the walls stretched deeper than he had imagined. He followed the tunnel, the narrow path making him feel boxed in. His mind flashed with memories of Caleb's whispered fears. Someone watches her. Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened as he pressed on. After a few feet, the tunnel opened into another hidden space. Ethan shone the light around and froze. The room was slightly larger, just enough to crouch comfortably, and in the far corner was something that made his stomach turn: a single metal chair and a stack of crumpled clothes. The implications were suffocating. Whoever had been here had built an entire hidden world behind the walls of their home. When Grace returned from the walk, she found Ethan waiting for her at the front door. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Ethan?" Grace asked, panic rising in her voice. "What did you find?" He opened the door and ushered her inside, closing it behind her before kneeling to meet Caleb's gaze. "Can you take Olivia to your room for a little while, buddy? I need to talk to Mom alone." Caleb hesitated, his protective instinct kicking in, but Grace gently touched his shoulder. "It is okay, sweetheart. We will call you in soon." Caleb nodded reluctantly and led Olivia away. When they were gone, Grace turned to Ethan, fear etched across her face. "Tell me." Ethan exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. "There is more. Another passage. And another room." Grace's breath caught. "Another room?" He nodded, his voice low. "It looks like someone used it as a hiding place for a long time." Grace sank onto the couch, her hand trembling. "We cannot stay here, Ethan. Not like this." Ethan knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I know. I have already called Detective Harris. They are sending someone to investigate." Grace nodded, her eyes glassy with tears. "What if they do not find him? What if he comes back?" Ethan's grip tightened. "Then we will make sure this house is sealed. Nothing and no one will ever get near our kids again." That evening, the police returned with more officers and forensic equipment. Detective Harris stood in the nursery, his arms crossed, as Ethan explained what he had found. The officers began taking photos, dusting for fingerprints, and documenting every inch of the hidden spaces. Detective Harris crouched near the opening, shaking his head. "In all my years, I have never seen anything like this. Whoever was living here knew exactly how to stay hidden." Grace stood in the hallway, clutching Olivia tightly, while Caleb peeked out from behind her leg. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a flicker of relief. The investigation stretched late into the night. Finally, Detective Harris approached Ethan and Grace. "We found enough evidence to run a fingerprint search. Hopefully, we will know who we are dealing with soon." Grace's voice was tight with emotion. "What happens until then?" "We will increase patrols in the neighborhood, and I suggest staying somewhere else until we can secure the house." Grace nodded, already making a mental list of what to pack. Ethan hesitated, but finally agreed. "We will leave in the morning." That night, the family slept in the same room. Caleb lay between his parents, his small hand resting protectively on Olivia's tiny back. In the dark, Grace whispered, "Do you think he will be caught?" Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. "I hope so. But no matter what, we will make this right." Grace reached for his hand. "We are stronger together." Ethan squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering faith. In the quiet room, Caleb's soft breaths mingled with Olivia's tiny sighs, and for the first time in days, Ethan let his eyes close. They would face this together. The morning air was crisp as Ethan loaded their overnight bags into the car. Caleb stood beside him, gripping his blanket tightly. Grace sat in the back seat with Olivia, who babbled happily, unaware of the tension around her. Ethan closed the trunk and knelt in front of Caleb. "We are just going to stay at Grandma's for a few days. The police are going to check everything, okay?" Caleb nodded, though his eyes were still wary. "Is it because of the man in the wall?" Ethan hesitated, then rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes, buddy, but the police will make sure he never comes back." Caleb seemed to take some comfort in his father's words and climbed into the car. As they pulled out of the driveway, Grace looked back at the house, at the windows where shadows used to feel harmless, at the nursery where their fears had grown. She had loved that house once, but now it felt like a stranger. At Grace's mother's house, they were welcomed with warm hugs and reassurance. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee drifted through the air, but even the cozy surroundings could not fully settle Grace's nerves. As Grace and her mother talked in the kitchen, Ethan sat with Caleb in the living room. Olivia played nearby, giggling as she tugged on a soft toy. Caleb, however, remained quiet. "You are thinking about the man again, aren't you?" Ethan asked gently. Caleb nodded without looking up. "Do you think they will find him?" Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I do, and I need you to know that none of this is your fault. You were brave, Caleb. You protected your sister, and you helped us understand what was really happening." Caleb's lip quivered. "But I was scared." Ethan smiled softly. "Being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you are." Caleb's eyes met his father's, a flicker of pride shining through the fear. Later that evening, the phone rang. Grace picked it up, her hand shaking slightly. "Hello? Mrs. Harper, this is Detective Harris. We have an update." Grace's heart pounded. "What did you find?" The detective's voice was calm, but serious. "We identified the man from the fingerprints found in the tunnels. His name is James Wacth. He was a former tenant of your house." Grace blinked, confused. "A tenant? But why?" "According to our records, he lived there about 10 years ago with his wife and daughter. After his wife left him, he lost the house and eventually disappeared. It seems like he came back." The weight of the words pressed down on Grace. "He was living in the walls, watching my children." Detective Harris's voice softened. "I know this is hard to hear, but from what we found, he did not take anything, and there was no sign of harmful intent." He paused. "We think he was grieving." Grace felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and something unexpected. Pity. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to steady herself. "Have you found him?" "Not yet, but we are close. We found some signs of him staying in abandoned buildings nearby. We will keep you updated." "Thank you," Grace whispered before hanging up. She stood still for a moment, trying to process everything. Ethan entered the room, noticing her pale face. "What did they say?" Grace repeated everything the detective had told her. Ethan listened, his expression growing grim. "He was living in the walls," Grace whispered, "because he had nowhere else to go." Ethan shook his head. "That does not excuse what he did. He invaded our home. He watched our children." Grace wrapped her arms around herself. "But he did not hurt them. He could have, but he did not." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Grace, we cannot let pity cloud what happened. We have to protect our family." Grace nodded. "I know, but I also can't stop thinking about how broken he must have been." The next day, the police found James Wacth hiding in an abandoned warehouse a few miles from their neighborhood. When the officers approached, he did not run or resist. Instead, he sat quietly on the edge of a dusty cot, his face hollow and tired. "I never meant to scare them," he murmured as the officers placed him in handcuffs. wanted to be close to a family again. At the station, James gave a full confession. His words were slow, fragmented by years of isolation. She reminded me of my little girl. Olivia did. So small, so perfect. His voice cracked as he continued. I just wanted to watch over her. When the phone rang again that evening, Ethan answered. Detective Harris spoke briefly, confirming James's arrest and detailing what had happened. After hanging up, Ethan sat beside Grace on the couch, his thoughts heavy. He said Olivia reminded him of his daughter, Ethan said quietly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. He was broken. Ethan nodded, though his jaw was tight. But he was still dangerous. Grace leaned into him, her voice soft. I keep thinking, what if he had gotten help before things got this bad? Ethan wrapped an arm around her. I do not know, but what I do know is that he is not coming back. Grace wiped her eyes and nodded. We can finally feel safe again. That night, as the kids slept peacefully, Ethan and Grace stayed up talking. For the first time in days, their words were not filled with fear, but with hope. We will rebuild, Ethan said. Seal every inch of that house. Make it safe again. And maybe, Grace added softly, we can find a way to teach Caleb that kindness can exist, even when things are scary. Ethan kissed her temple. We will show him that love is stronger than fear. As they drifted off to sleep, the weight of the past began to lift, replaced by the quiet promise of healing. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Grace's mother's house, casting golden light over the breakfast table. Olivia babbled as Grace spooned mashed bananas onto her tray, but Caleb picked at his toast in silence. Ethan sipped his coffee and watched his son with a growing sense of unease. Are you okay, buddy? Ethan asked softly. Caleb hesitated, staring at his plate. After a long pause, he whispered, You found him, didn't you? Ethan's heart tightened. He set his mug down. Yes, the police found him yesterday. Grace's hand stilled midair as she reached for Olivia's bottle. Caleb's wide eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. Is he gone? Ethan nodded. He is not coming back. Caleb lowered his gaze, biting his lip. Did they say why he was watching Olivia? Grace knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. They think he was sad. He used to have a daughter, and he lost her. Caleb looked up at his mother, his expression thoughtful. I knew he was sad. Ethan and Grace exchanged a startled glance. How did you know that, sweetheart? Grace asked gently. Caleb's fingers twisted the hem of his shirt. He spoke so quietly they had to lean in to hear him. Because I saw him. The night Olivia came home. The room fell silent. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. Ethan sat frozen, his breath caught in his throat. You saw him? Ethan asked carefully. Caleb nodded. I woke up because I heard footsteps. When I got to the nursery, he was already there. Caleb's voice trembled. He was standing by the crib, just looking at her. Grace pulled Caleb into a hug, her arms wrapping tightly around him. Oh, sweetheart. Caleb clung to her, his small body trembling. I was too scared to tell you. I thought maybe he would go away if I stayed near her. Ethan knelt beside them, placing a reassuring hand on Caleb's back. You were so brave, Caleb. You did everything you could to protect Olivia. Caleb's voice was muffled against Grace's shoulder. He never tried to hurt her. I think he just missed his little girl. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she kissed Caleb's hair. I am so sorry you went through that alone. Ethan's jaw tightened as he processed his son's quiet confession. We should have listened to you sooner, he said. But we are listening now. The rest of the day passed in quiet reflection. Grace took the kids for a walk through the park, hoping the fresh air would lift Caleb's spirits. He held her hand tightly, still processing everything. As they passed a playground filled with laughter and shouts, Caleb slowed his steps. Grace knelt beside him. "What is it, sweetheart?" Caleb looked at the children running and playing, his expression distant. "Do you think he used to play with his daughter there?" Grace felt a pang in her chest. "Maybe," she said softly. "I think he loved her very much." Caleb frowned. "Then why did she leave him?" Grace exhaled slowly. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, or they lose their way. It does not mean they stop loving, but it can make them feel very lost and sad." Caleb's brow furrowed as he tried to understand. After a moment, he squeezed Grace's hand. "I'm glad I still have you and Dad. And Olivia." Grace smiled, blinking back tears. "And we are so lucky to have you." That evening they gathered in the living room, cozy under soft blankets as the sun set. Caleb sat between Ethan and Grace, resting his head on Grace's shoulder. Olivia dozed peacefully in her playpen. "Mom?" Caleb asked after a long stretch of silence. "Yes, sweetheart?" Caleb hesitated, then said, "Do you think he ever felt safe?" Grace felt Ethan shift beside her. She thought about James Wacth, the lonely figure who had hidden behind their walls, trying to feel close to something he had lost. "I do not think he did," she answered honestly. "But I hope he does now. The police said he will get the help he needs." Caleb nodded slowly. "I hope he does too." Ethan wrapped an arm around his son. "It takes a kind heart to wish that for someone who scared you. I am proud of you, buddy." Caleb's lips curved into a small but genuine smile. For the first time in days, he looked lighter, as though some of the weight had lifted from his small shoulders. The next morning, Detective Harris called with more updates. "We have secured the entire house. The passages have been sealed, and additional reinforcements have been added. You can return whenever you are ready." Ethan felt a surge of relief, but also apprehension. He thanked the detective and hung up, turning to Grace. "The house is ready." Grace's gaze softened as she glanced at Caleb, who was playing on the floor with Olivia. "Do you think he is ready?" Ethan sighed. "I think we have to show him it is home again, that it is safe." Grace nodded. Together. When they arrived back at the house later that day, the sun was shining bright, and the familiar creak of the front steps welcomed them home. Ethan unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The nursery was the last room they checked. The wall where the hidden passage had been was now solid, reinforced with fresh paint and sturdy wood. Caleb hesitated at the doorway. Ethan knelt beside him. "It is okay. You can go in." Caleb took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The nightlight cast its familiar warm glow. Olivia's crib stood in its usual place, and soft stuffed animals filled the shelf. Caleb approached the crib, watching his sister sleep. Grace watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride as Caleb leaned over and gently kissed Olivia's forehead. "I will always protect you," he whispered. Grace felt a tear slide down her cheek. Ethan placed a hand on her back, his own eyes misty. As they stood together in the quiet nursery, the weight of the past seemed to settle into something softer. They had faced something terrifying, but they had faced it as a family. And now, they were ready to move forward stronger, kinder, and more resilient than ever. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt different, not eerie or heavy, but still, as though it was holding its breath. Caleb stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Olivia sleep. The soft hum of her lullaby mobile drifted through the room like a calming breeze. Ethan watched from a few steps behind, his heart full of pride and unease. Grace entered the room, setting a folded blanket on the crib's edge. Caleb looked up and asked softly, "What happens to him now?" Ethan knelt beside his son, resting a hand on his shoulder. "The police said James will get help. They took him to a place where people can take care of him and help him feel less lost." Caleb nodded slowly, his small brow furrowed. "Do you think he was always like that? Hiding, I mean." Grace's chest ached as she knelt beside him. No, sweetheart. People are not born like that. Sometimes life is very hard, and they do not know where else to turn. Caleb stared at Olivia for a long moment. He just wanted to see her, because she reminded him of his daughter, right? Grace and Ethan exchanged a glance. Grace nodded gently. That is what they believe. Ethan's jaw tightened. But no matter how sad someone is, it does not make what he did okay. Caleb's small shoulders lifted as he took a deep breath. I am still mad at him, he admitted. But I also feel bad for him. Grace's throat tightened. That is because you have a kind heart, Caleb. A few days later, the family was invited to the police station to speak with Detective Harris. He had called with an update and told Ethan and Grace it might be good for Caleb to come too, especially since he had been such a key part of their understanding of what happened. The station was quieter than Caleb had expected. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Detective Harris greeted them with a warm, reassuring smile and led them into his office, offering Caleb a seat in the chair beside his parents. I wanted to give you some closure, Harris began, folding his hands on his desk. James Wyatt has been moved to a long-term care facility. He admitted everything, how he lost his home and how he returned, hoping to feel close to his family again. Ethan nodded, but asked carefully, Did he ever plan to hurt anyone? Harris shook his head. No, his intention was never violence. He said he watched Olivia because she reminded him of his daughter. In his mind, he thought he was protecting her. Grace let out a shaky breath, but Harris continued. That does not make it right, of course, but it is important for you all to know that his actions came from a place of grief, not malice. Caleb leaned forward. Did he ever talk about his daughter? Harris nodded. Yes, he said she was his whole world before things fell apart. He brought things into the walls that belonged to her, like the stuffed bear and the doll. Those were hers. Caleb's face softened. He kept them because he missed her. Grace placed a hand on Caleb's knee, silently offering comfort. Harris's eyes softened as he looked at the boy. You have a lot of empathy for someone your age. That is rare. Caleb hesitated, then asked, Does he know we are okay? Harris nodded. Yes, and I think that helped him feel some peace. The ride home was quiet, but this time it felt peaceful rather than heavy. Olivia dozed in her car seat, and Caleb stared out the window, watching the trees blur by. When they pulled into the driveway, Ethan turned off the car, but did not get out right away. He looked back at Caleb. You did something really brave today, buddy, asking about James. That took courage. Caleb smiled faintly. I just wanted to understand. Ethan reached over and squeezed his shoulder. That is what makes you such an amazing big brother and an amazing person. Caleb's smile grew a little wider. That evening, as they settled in for the night, the house felt warmer. Grace tucked Olivia into her crib, the soft glow of the nightlight illuminating her tiny face. Caleb stood beside her, holding his blanket tightly but no longer out of fear. You ready to sleep in your own room tonight? Grace asked gently. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. I think so, but can I check on her before I go to bed? Grace smiled and ruffled his hair. Of course. Ethan appeared in the doorway, watching the quiet scene unfold. Grace kissed Caleb's forehead before following Ethan down the hall. They watched from the living room as Caleb leaned over the crib and whispered, Good night, Olivia. I will always protect you. Ethan wrapped an arm around Grace. He is healing, he said quietly. Grace leaned into him. We all are. The following morning, Grace and Caleb made pancakes together while Olivia babbled from her high chair. The smell of syrup and butter filled the kitchen as sunlight streamed in. Dad, do you want blueberries in yours? Caleb asked, his usual energy returning. Ethan laughed as he set the table. Of course, blueberries make everything better. Caleb stirred the batter with a flourish, a grin spreading across his face. Grace watched him, her heart swelling with pride. It had been a hard road, but seeing her son's laughter return felt like the first sign of spring after a long winter. After breakfast, Caleb asked if they could go to the park. Grace and Ethan agreed, and they spent the afternoon playing catch and pushing Olivia in the baby swing. Caleb raced from one end of the playground to the other, his laughter echoing through the crisp air. At one point, he paused near the benches and said, "Do you think James ever came here with his daughter?" Grace knelt beside him and nodded. "I think so." Caleb was quiet for a moment before whispering, "I hope she knew he loved her." Grace's throat tightened as she hugged him. "I think she did. Just like Olivia knows how much you love her." Caleb smiled and hugged his mom back before running off to climb the monkey bars. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, Ethan watched Caleb play with Olivia on the floor. She giggled as he made silly faces, her tiny hands reaching for his. Grace sat beside Ethan, her head resting on his shoulder. "It feels like home again," she murmured. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, and it feels stronger." As Olivia let out a happy squeal and Caleb burst into laughter, the room filled with warmth. The memories of fear and uncertainty would always linger, but they no longer held the family captive. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had found their way back to the light. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of breakfast plates clinking and Olivia's squeals of delight as she waved her spoon in the air. Caleb sat at the table, chattering between bites of pancakes, while Ethan sipped his coffee, stealing a smile at Grace. The nightmare of the past few weeks felt distant, like a shadow finally fading into the light. Yet, even in the calm, the questions lingered. As they cleared the table, Caleb suddenly spoke. "Dad, do you think James was scared when the police found him?" Ethan paused, placing a dish in the sink. Grace exchanged a glance with him before kneeling beside Caleb. "Maybe," Ethan said carefully, "but I think he was also relieved." Caleb's brow furrowed. "Relieved?" Grace nodded. He had been alone for so long. Maybe, deep down, he wanted someone to know where he was, so he did not have to hide anymore. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I wonder if anyone visited him before everything went bad." The simple question hit harder than Grace expected. She knelt and brushed Caleb's hair back. "Sometimes people lose touch with the ones they love, even when they need them most." Caleb seemed to absorb her words before whispering, "I hope he is not alone anymore." Ethan knelt beside them, placing a reassuring hand on Caleb's back. "He will not be. The people at the care facility will help him. He is not our responsibility anymore, buddy. What matters now is that we are safe and we are here for each other." Caleb nodded slowly. "I know, but I still hope he feels better one day." Later that day, Ethan and Grace decided to take the family out to the farmer's market. The air was warm with the smell of fresh bread, roasted nuts, and apple cider. Colorful stands overflowed with pumpkins, flowers, and handmade crafts. Caleb held Grace's hand as they wandered past the rows of vendors. Olivia sat in her stroller, fascinated by the bright banners flapping in the breeze. Caleb's face was thoughtful as they passed a booth selling carved wooden toys. Ethan stopped and picked up a small, hand-carved bear. "What do you think, Caleb?" Caleb's eyes widened. The bear looked almost like the one he had seen in James Wyatt's hidden room, the one that had belonged to James's daughter. But this one was clean, polished, and new, with a kind smile carved into its face. Grace knelt down. "Do you want it, sweetheart?" Caleb bit his lip, then nodded. "Yes, but I want to leave it for James." Ethan blinked in surprise. "For James?" Caleb nodded again. "If he ever comes back to the house, I want him to know we do not hate him." Grace felt her throat tighten. She exchanged a glance with Ethan, who gave a small nod of understanding. Okay, Grace said softly. We can do that. Ethan paid for the bear, and Caleb held it carefully as they continued walking. His small hand wrapped around the wooden figure as though holding more than a toy. He was holding compassion in its purest form. That evening, after they returned home, Caleb stood in the nursery for a long time, the bear cradled in his hands. Olivia was already fast asleep in her crib, her soft breaths filling the quiet room. Grace watched from the hallway as Caleb gently placed the wooden bear on the windowsill. She walked in and knelt beside him. "Why here?" Caleb shrugged. "It feels like the right place, so he knows we are not afraid anymore." Grace wrapped an arm around him. "That is such a kind thing to do, Caleb." He leaned into her. "I do not want to be scared forever." "You will not be," she whispered, "because you are stronger than fear. You always have been." A few days later, Grace received a call from Detective Harris. His voice was calm, but there was a softness to it that made Grace pause. "Mrs. Harper, I wanted to let you know, James Wyatt asked us to send you a message." Grace's heart skipped. "A message?" Harris hesitated. "He wanted you to know that he is sorry. He said he never meant to hurt anyone, and that he is grateful you were kind. Even after everything." Grace felt a tear slide down her cheek. "He said that?" "Yes," Harris replied. "I know it does not undo what happened, but I thought you should know." Grace closed her eyes, letting the weight of the words settle. "Thank you, Detective." When she hung up, she sat quietly in the living room, turning the message over in her mind. Ethan sat beside her, his brows knit with concern. "What did Harris say?" Grace repeated the detective's words. Ethan's expression shifted from guarded to something more complex, an unexpected blend of sadness and relief. "He apologized," Ethan murmured. "I never thought." Grace nodded. "Me either." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Do you think he will get better?" Grace rested her head on his shoulder. "I hope so. For his sake and for his daughter's memory." That night, Caleb came into their room, his blanket draped over his shoulders. "Mom? Dad?" Ethan sat up. "What is it, buddy?" Caleb shuffled closer. I think I am not scared anymore." Grace smiled, brushing the hair from his face. "That is because you are brave." Caleb nodded, his eyes serious. "But if anything bad ever comes back, I will still protect Olivia." Ethan pulled Caleb into a hug. "We know you will." Caleb stayed for a few more moments before heading back to his room. Grace and Ethan lay back down, their hearts a little lighter. The house, once filled with shadows and fear, now felt warm again like home. The next morning, as the sun poured through the windows, Grace found Caleb in the nursery, sitting by Olivia's crib. The wooden bear still rested on the windowsill, catching the morning light. Caleb turned to her and smiled. "It is nice in here now." Grace knelt beside him. "Yes, it is." As Olivia giggled and reached for her brother, Grace felt a swell of pride. Caleb's journey had not just been about fear, it had been about compassion, resilience, and understanding. He had learned that kindness could live even in the darkest places. As she watched her children together, Grace knew they had come out stronger, not because they had avoided fear, but because they had faced it and chosen hope. The morning sun spilled across the living room floor as Ethan and Grace sorted through boxes of supplies they had picked up from the hardware store. Ceiling kits, paint cans, and new window locks were spread out in neat piles. The house was quiet except for Olivia's soft babbles as she played on her mat and Caleb's humming as he sat by the bookshelf, flipping through one of his favorite adventure books. "We will get this done today," Ethan said, brushing sawdust off his hands. "By tonight, the house will feel new." Grace smiled but looked over at Caleb. "It is not just about making the house stronger, it is about helping Caleb feel safe again." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. We will. By mid-morning, the house was a flurry of quiet but determined movement. Ethan worked on reinforcing the windows and doors, while Grace sealed cracks and added fresh coats of paint to the nursery walls. Caleb was eager to help, holding tools for his dad and offering suggestions about where to place the extra locks. "Can we make the nursery look different?" Caleb asked as he handed Ethan a screwdriver. "So it does not feel like before." Grace wiped her hands on a rag and knelt down. "What do you think we should change?" Caleb's eyes brightened as he pointed to the wall near the crib. "We can put up shelves for Olivia's toys and books, and maybe we can paint the ceiling with stars." Ethan smiled, proud of his son's thoughtfulness. "That is a great idea. Let's do it." They made a trip to the store for shelving and a stencil kit with glow-in-the-dark stars. Caleb held the box tightly as they returned home, his steps lighter than they had been in days. By afternoon, the nursery had transformed. The shelves were filled with colorful picture books and soft toys. A mobile with little paper stars hung over Olivia's crib, and the ceiling was painted a soft blue with tiny, glowing constellations. Caleb lay on the floor, looking up at the stars they had painted. "It looks like the sky," he said, smiling. Grace lay down beside him and pointed to one of the constellations they had made. "See that one? It looks like a bear." Caleb laughed softly. "Like the wooden bear we left." Ethan sat cross-legged beside them, brushing his hand over Caleb's hair. "Every time you look at these stars, remember how brave you are. You faced the darkness and made it beautiful." Caleb's grin widened, and for the first time in a while, his laugh filled the room without hesitation. Later that evening, they sat together in the living room with popcorn and warm blankets, watching Caleb's favorite movie. Olivia was tucked safely in her crib, her baby monitor glowing on the coffee table. The house felt peaceful again, no hidden corners, no dark spaces that could hide secrets. Halfway through the movie, Caleb turned to Grace. "Do you think Olivia will remember any of this when she gets older?" Grace smiled gently. "No, sweetheart, she is too little. But we will remember, and we will tell her stories about how strong her big brother was." Caleb's cheeks flushed with pride. "Will we tell her about James?" Ethan's eyes softened. "Maybe, someday. We will tell her about how sometimes people get lost, and how important it is to have kindness and strength, like you." Caleb seemed satisfied with that answer, and rested his head on Grace's shoulder. The next morning, as the light filtered through the nursery window, Grace stood in the doorway, taking in the new space. The shelves were neatly organized, the fresh paint brightened the room, and the stenciled stars above seemed to twinkle in the morning sun. Olivia lay in her crib, giggling as she reached for the paper stars hanging above her. Caleb was already beside her, gently winding up her music box. "Do you like it, Olivia?" Caleb asked softly. Olivia cooed and kicked her legs, her tiny face full of joy. Grace stepped in and kissed Caleb's head. "You gave her something special, a safe, happy place to grow." Caleb beamed. "I wanted her to feel safe, like I do now." Ethan walked in, his hands dusty from finishing the last bit of work in the house. He wiped his hands on a towel and joined them. "It is done," Ethan said, a sense of finality in his voice. "Every door, every window, it is all secure." Grace wrapped her arm around his waist. "This house feels like home again." Ethan nodded, his gaze resting on Caleb. "Because we made it that way together." That evening, as Grace and Ethan sat outside on the porch, they listened to the soft hum of the neighborhood. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and a couple of neighbors walked their dogs down the street. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed normal again. Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "I think we are finally okay." Ethan exhaled slowly, as though releasing the last of his tension. "Yeah, we are." Inside the house, Caleb was tucking Olivia in for the night. He leaned over her crib and whispered, I will always watch over you." He touched one of the glowing stars on the ceiling and smiled. As the days passed, life fell back into a comfortable rhythm. Caleb's nightmares faded, replaced by the bright, curious energy that had always been part of him. Olivia grew stronger and more playful, her giggles filling the house. Grace and Ethan still jumped at unexpected noises now and then, but their fear no longer controlled them. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Caleb spoke up. "Do you think James knows we are okay now?" Ethan looked at his son thoughtfully. "I think he does." Caleb nodded, satisfied. "Good. I want him to know we are not scared anymore." Grace reached across the table and took Caleb's hand. "And that is because of you." Caleb squeezed her hand. "It is because of all of us." Ethan raised his glass of lemonade. "To new beginnings." Caleb clinked his glass against his dad's. "To new beginnings." That night, as the stars on the nursery ceiling glowed softly and the house settled into its quiet hum, Grace and Ethan knew the truth. Their home was more than just four walls. It was a place of resilience, love, and hope, a place that had been broken but rebuilt stronger. And in the quiet glow of the nursery, Caleb whispered one last time, "Good night, Olivia. You are safe." For the first time in what felt like forever, he believed it. The days stretched into weeks, and the Harper family fell into a steady rhythm again. The morning sun filtered through the windows, and the scent of coffee and waffles filled the air. Olivia giggled as Grace wiped her sticky fingers with a damp cloth. Caleb sat across from her, pouring syrup over his pancakes with a focused grin. The heaviness that had once clouded their home had finally lifted. Ethan entered the kitchen with a toolbox in hand. He was still double-checking every lock and latch, though it had become more of a habit than a necessity. Grace smiled knowingly. "Everything still holding up?" Ethan shrugged with a playful grin. "You can never be too careful." Caleb looked up from his plate, syrup on his chin. "Dad, you fixed that window twice last week." Ethan ruffled Caleb's hair. "That's because I promised to keep you and Olivia safe, and I take that seriously." Caleb nodded, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Me too." Grace knelt beside him. "You already have, sweetheart." Later that afternoon, they decided to visit the park. The air was crisp, and the sun hung low in the sky, turning the leaves a brilliant gold. Olivia clapped her hands in delight as Grace pushed her on the baby swing, and Caleb raced toward the climbing bars, his laughter ringing through the cool breeze. Ethan jogged to catch up, calling after him, "Think you can beat me in a race, huh?" "Of course!" Caleb yelled, his face lit with joy as he scrambled up the highest bar. Grace stood by, watching her family with a heart full of gratitude. The memories of fear and uncertainty still whispered sometimes, but they had become echoes of lessons learned rather than shadows of what they had lost. As they packed up to head home, Caleb stopped by a small bench near the edge of the playground. It was empty, the wood worn but sturdy. He stood there for a moment, thoughtful. Grace watched him quietly before walking over. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Caleb brushed his fingers over the carved initials on the bench. "Do you think James ever sat here with his daughter?" Grace knelt beside him, meeting his gaze. "He might have." Caleb's eyes softened. "I hope he gets better, so he does not feel lost anymore." Grace took a slow breath and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "I hope so too." Ethan called from the path, holding Olivia in his arms. "Are you two readies?" Caleb nodded and ran to catch up. As Grace followed, she felt a quiet pride swell in her chest, not just for Caleb's bravery, but for his compassion. He had faced his fears and come out stronger, kinder. When they arrived home, the warm hum of the house greeted them like an old friend. Olivia wriggled in Ethan's arms, eager to be set down. Caleb kicked off his shoes and darted to the nursery, as he always did, to check on his sister's crib. Grace and Ethan followed, standing in the doorway as Caleb sat by the crib and reached for the wooden bear on the windowsill. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the smooth edges. "It is still here," he said softly. Ethan stepped forward and crouched beside him. "Of course it is. We left it as a reminder that we choose hope." Caleb nodded and set the bear back down gently. "I like that." That evening, after they tucked Olivia into bed and read Caleb his favorite bedtime story, Ethan and Grace sat together on the couch. The quiet of the house felt different now, not eerie or tense, but peaceful. Grace rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how far we have come?" Ethan sighed, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "All the time." He paused, brushing his thumb over her hand. "We were lucky, but more than that, we were strong." Grace nodded. "Because we faced it together." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft hum of the baby monitor. The familiar creaks of the house no longer sent chills down their spines. Instead, they were comforting a reminder that this was their home, their safe place. As the months passed, the memories of the incident settled into something quieter, a part of their story, but not the defining chapter. Caleb returned to school, his energy and curiosity shining as brightly as ever. Olivia took her first wobbly steps in the nursery while Caleb cheered her on, clapping and laughing. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Caleb looked up from his plate and asked, "Do you think Olivia will remember how safe she was?" Grace smiled softly. "She might not remember it, but she will always know it. Because of you." Caleb's face lit up with pride. "I am her big brother. I will always protect her." Ethan raised his glass of lemonade. "And we will always protect each other." Caleb grinned and clinked his glass against his dad's. "Together." As the stars outside twinkled and the nursery filled with the soft glow of the ceiling's painted constellations, the Harper family felt the weight of their journey settle into something steady and strong. Caleb lay in bed that night, the faint hum of the nightlight filling his room. Before he closed his eyes, he whispered into the quiet, "Good night, Olivia. You are safe." In the nursery, Olivia stirred slightly, a tiny smile forming as she dreamed. The house, once filled with shadows and fear, now radiated warmth, love, and resilience. They had endured something unimaginable, but they had rebuilt their world stronger, brick by brick, with trust, kindness, and hope. The Harper family's journey reminds us that even in the darkest moments, love, resilience, and kindness can light the way. They faced their fears, grew stronger together, and showed that no challenge is too great when we stand as a family. If this story touched your heart and you want to hear more stories of courage, hope, and compassion, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inspire and uplift. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter what you face, you are never alone when you have love by your side. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of family, bravery, and kindness.